In this video, we're going to examine the functional unit of the kidney called a nephron. There is one nephron right there. Here's another picture of the nephron. You can see it's similar to what it looked like before, but now it's surrounded by capillaries. If you remember, the kidney has at least two distinctive parts. We see the cortex, which is towards the outside, and then the medulla is towards the middle. And if we were to take a sliver of that, we'd have the cortex up here and the medulla down there. So we see the nephron exists in both the cortex and the medulla. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and it has a lot of functions, but its primary function is to produce urine. There's two main parts of the nephron. There's the renal corpuscle, which is this area here. And then there's the renal tubule, which starts here. And then it's got a big loop to it, and then ends up over here. Let's look at a more sophisticated cartoon, if you will. So here's the same thing, but we're going to look at some more parts. So the renal corpuscle has something called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is this ball of capillaries right here. And it's surrounded by the glomerular capsule, which is this. Another name for the glomerular capsule is the Bowman's capsule. And then in the renal tubule, we have the proximal convoluted tubule. It's proximal because it's most proximal to the glomerulus. So here's the proximal convoluted tubule. And then we have the nephron loop. That's this, the part that looks like a loop. Oftentimes goes by the name loop of Henle. And then we have the distal convoluted tubule. It's distal because it's distal or further away from the glomerular capsule. So this is the distal convoluted tubule, and it's labeled right there. And then lastly, we have the collecting duct. The collecting duct is a duct that connects multiple nephrons to one tube, and then this tube dumps into the renal pelvis. Let's look at some kidney histology. So you've seen some of this before. If we were to observe this kidney, we'd see the outer cortex and then this inner medulla. When we zoom in on the cortex, what you see are lots of glomeruli. So there's a glomerulus, there's a glomerulus, there's another glomerulus. And if we zoom in closer, you'll see actually the capillaries themselves in here. And surrounding the glomerulus, remember, is the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. That's made of simple squamous epithelium. So here's the Bowman's capsule. Here's another one you can see there. There's another one there. And that's simple squamous epithelium that lines it. And then these are the capillaries in the inside here. So we also have, you can see these simple cuboidal cells. There's some there. There's some more there. You can see there's a distinction between sort of these and then what these look like. So one of them would be the proximal convoluted tubule. The other would be the distal convoluted tubule. I'm not sure which is which anymore, but those would be the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. Now let's move closer to the medulla. As we move closer to the medulla, you see we're not seeing any glomeruli anymore. This would be all collecting duct. As well as probably the nephron loops. Which ones are the nephron loops and which ones are the collecting ducts? Again, I'm not sure about that, nor do I know that we care. But you can see that this is also simple cuboidal epithelium. Remember, the primary function of the nephron is to produce urine, and it does that by filtering the blood. So blood enters into the glomerulus right here. It's filtered. And then when the filtrate travels through the proximal convoluted tubule, a lot of the substances are reabsorbed into these peritubular capillaries, and then that's back into the body. And then as the filtrate goes through the nephron loop, it goes through the distal convoluted tubule, additional materials are absorbed, and then some are secreted, and then ultimately what winds up going through the collecting duct is urine. So the pathway is blood plasma is filtered at the glomerulus. Filtrate then moves into the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. that filtrate travels through the proximal convoluted tubule and the nephron loop, and then through the distal convoluted tubule. And as it does that, some substances are reabsorbed and some are secreted. And then what goes through the collecting duct is urine. And as we learned in the previous video, that urine is sort of released in the minor calyx, goes to a major calyx, and then from the renal pelvis, it then travels down the ureter through peristalsis, is stored in the bladder, and then is ultimately evacuated from the bladder through the urethra. If we wanted to study the physiology of the nephron, I think we can most easily do that by breaking up urine production into three parts: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So first, filtration. Filtration takes place here at the glomerulus. Astonishingly, there's 180 liters of glomerular filtrate produced each day. 180 liters, that's about as much water as you would have in your bathtub if you were taking a bath. So your kidneys are certainly not lazy organs. The filtrate, remember the filtrate is what's being filtered from the blood plasma. That consists mostly of water, electrolytes like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride ions, bicarbonate ions, sulfate, phosphate, stuff like that. Glucose or sugar, amino acids, nitrogenous waste like urea and uric acid, and then other products, pharmaceuticals, and maybe some small proteins, things like that. So let's look at what that might look like. So blood is traveling through the afferent arteriole. It's called afferent because it's going towards the glomerular capsule. And it's not shown super well in this diagram, but this afferent arteriole has a larger diameter than the efferent arteriole does. And since this is smaller, you sort of builds up this hydrostatic pressure, which then forces plasma from the blood out of these capillaries and into this Bowman's capsule here. So we can zoom in on that. So here's the afferent arteriole. Blood's flowing in here, and then blood is filtered in the glomerulus. And if we looked at that, we'd see that it has what's called fenestrations, or it has these little holes in it. So this is just simple squamous epithelium. This is nothing more than like a specialized capillary with holes. And then also it has these types of cells called podocytes. These podocytes prevent like large proteins from being filtered out. But either way, the blood plasma is filtered here. And then what actually exits the glomerulus and goes into the glomerular capsule, that stuff's called the filtrate. And then, of course, the blood that's not filtered travels back through this efferent arteriole or away from the glomerulus. And in this cartoon, you can see it a little better. The afferent arteriole is larger diameter than the efferent arteriole. That's what contributes to that hydrostatic pressure that forces the plasma out of the glomerulus as filtrate. After the blood plasma has been filtered, again, it travels through the efferent arteriole and then through these peritubular capillaries. And then the filtrate, that travels through the renal tubule. Remember, there's the proximal convoluted tubule, there would be the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. So this is just a simplified linear version, but it would be all twisted and convoluted. The second step in producing urine is reabsorption. Reabsorption is simply returning filtered substances to the bloodstream. We mentioned earlier that there's 180 liters per day of filtrate that's produced. And obviously you're not peeing out 180 liters per day. So most of that filtrate is actually reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So reabsorption is movement of substances, mostly from the proximal convoluted tubule, but along the whole length. So movement of substances from the tubule into the peritubular capillaries, or back into the body. And stuff that's reabsorbed would be like sodium ions, glucose, amino acids. Those are absorbed by active transport. You probably remember active transport from bio that requires using ATP. And then small proteins are reabsorbed by endocytosis. So here's a picture of endocytosis where the cell plasma membrane invaginates, and then it captures stuff that's outside the cell and then brings it back in the cell. And then after the sodium ions are absorbed, also potassium ions and a variety of other ions are reabsorbed. Some of the negative ions, like chloride, are reabsorbed simply because they're attracted to the positive sodium ion. So if we were to zoom in on that, so here we have active transport of sodium from the renal tubule into the peritubular capillaries. So here's sodium going back into the body, creating positive charges here in the capillary, and then negative chloride ions will then follow the positive sodium ions. And once we have, salt in here, there's a concentration gradient of salt in here that's higher than it is here. So consequently, water is also reabsorbed by osmosis. And there's other substances that are reabsorbed by active transport too, stuff like creatine. Creatine, you might remember from bio, is sort of like a way that ATP is recycled. Urea, that's a breakdown product of proteins. Uric acid, that's a breakdown product of DNA. So after your body has broke down like nucleic acids, there's some uric acid that's left. That gets filtered, and then most of that gets reabsorbed. Just like the urea, a lot of it gets reabsorbed, but ultimately some of it will end up being excreted as urine. Lactic acid, which is produced in your muscle cells during anaerobic respiration, and then other ions as well. We covered a lot of content on this slide, but the key takeaway is this. There's a lot of filtrate that's produced. Most of that filtrate never makes it to your bladder. Most of it is reabsorbed from the tubule into your body's capillaries or into the peritubular capillaries. And then the last step is secretion. So that's transport of substances from the plasma, that's in here, to the renal tubule. So that's shown by the yellow arrows. So we have active transport of potassium ions, also some organic compounds like histamine and penicillin, and protons or hydrogen ions. So some of the things that your body wants to get rid of, it can use active transport to pump it from the blood or from these capillaries into the tubule and then ultimately to be excreted. The hydrogen ion, I think, is one worth pausing on for a moment. You know that the hydrogen ion is a proton, which is acidic. So if you have a low pH, meaning that your blood is too acidic, one of the ways your body can maintain homeostasis is by secreting that acid in your urine. So your kidneys help you maintain body pH as well as produce urine. Lastly, let's look at some urine composition. Urine is mostly water, 95% water. It also contains these nitrogenous waste compounds. Remember, these are breakdown products of proteins and DNA. And there's trace amounts of amino acids and electrolytes. If there's any glucose in the urine or protein in the urine or blood cells in the urine, that can indicate disease. Maybe things like even diabetes or infection. Urine production. An individual produces about 0.6 to 2.5 liters of urine per day. Of course, that's highly dependent on the diet that you're consuming, the water that you're consuming, as well as the exercise that you're participating in. So an average person will generate or produce about 50 to 60 milliliters per hour. That's normal. Anything less than 50 milliliters per hour may indicate kidney disease. So I don't think we need to know any of these specifics, but if you wanted to look at the composition of urine, that's spelled out for you in this last column. So you can compare what is in your urine with what is in your blood. And you can see that one of the things we're doing is we're getting rid of nitrogenous waste. So urea and uric acid is fairly low in the plasma, at least especially compared to what is found in the urine.